At the dawn of the 20th century, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen sent nearly 500,000 soldiers to defeat a nation of farmers. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the globe. Its navy ruled every ocean. Its confidence was absolute. And yet, a scattered force of perhaps 80,000 Afrikaner horsemen, armed with rifles and a ferocious love of their land, brought that empire to its knees. The war that followed lasted nearly 3 years, cost Britain the equivalent of hundreds of billions in today's money, and killed more than 60,000 people in concentration camps alone, most of them women and children. But how did a colonial war against a tiny settler republic expose the rot at the heart of the greatest empire in history? In this documentary, we will trace the full arc of the Boer War, from the first Dutch ships anchoring at the Cape in 1652 to the peace agreement that left South Africa scarred for generations. At the southern tip of Africa, where two great oceans collide in churning, salt-white fury, a small Dutch fleet dropped anchor in April 1652. The commander of that expedition, Jan van Riebeck, had not come to conquer a continent. His employers, the powerful Dutch East India Company, wanted something far more modest, a garden. A place where their merchant vessels, battered by months at sea, could stop for fresh water, vegetables, and meat before pressing on to the spice islands of the east. Van Riebeck's little fort at the Cape of Good Hope was never supposed to become the seat of a nation. Yet that is precisely what it became. Within decades, the company's tidy refreshment station had begun to sprawl. Free burghers, settlers released from company contracts, pushed outward from the fort and into the vast, semi-arid interior. They called themselves Boeren, the Dutch word for farmers, and they took to the land with a particular ferocity. The Cape Colony grew not in the neat, ordered fashion of a planned settlement, but organically, stubbornly, driven by individual families seeking space and independence from any authority that tried to constrain them. What emerged over the following century was something entirely new. These settlers were no longer Dutch in any meaningful sense. Cut off from Europe, blended with German and French Huguenot immigrants who arrived in the 1690s, shaped by the brutal demands of frontier life, they forged a distinct identity. Their language, Afrikaans, grew from Dutch roots but became something rougher, more practical, stripped down by the African sun. Their faith, a stern and unyielding Calvinism, told them they were a chosen people, predestined by God for this harsh and beautiful land. That faith would prove enormously consequential. The Boer worldview was not simply religious. It was total. God had placed them here. The land was theirs. And any force, whether a distant colonial administration or a rival people, that threatened that conviction would be met with granite resistance. The people who had lived at the Cape long before any Dutch ship appeared were the Khoisan, skilled herders and hunters whose world was being dismantled with each passing decade. Dispossession, disease, and violence steadily destroyed their societies. Further east, the expanding settler frontier brought the Boers into collision with the Xhosa people, initiating a cycle of raids and reprisals that would define the eastern frontier for generations. These were not abstract political conflicts. They were fought over cattle, land, and survival. By 1795, the Dutch East India Company had collapsed, bankrupt, and broken. The Cape Colony stood at a crossroads, its Boer population numbering perhaps 15,000, scattered across a territory of staggering size, answering to almost no one. they would not remain ungoverned for long. A new imperial power was already sailing south, and its arrival would change everything. The ships that arrived at Table Bay in September 1795 flew British colors, and their commanders carried orders born not in Cape Town, but in the corridors of London and the chaos of revolutionary Europe. Napoleon's armies had swept across the Netherlands, toppling the old Dutch Republic and installing a client state in its place. Britain, determined to prevent France from seizing a strategic waypoint on the route to India, moved quickly. The Cape was too valuable to leave unguarded. That first occupation was temporary, a wartime measure. Under the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, Britain returned the colony to the Batavian Republic, the Dutch successor state. But peace with Napoleon never lasted. By 1806, British forces were back, and this time they intended to stay. The Convention of London in 1814 made it permanent. The Cape Colony, that windswept garden at the edge of the world, was now British property. For the Boer settlers scattered across the interior, this was not merely a change of flag. It was the beginning of a slow, grinding assault on everything they had built. The new administration wasted little time in making its priorities clear. English became the language of government, the courts, and official life. For a population that spoke Afrikaans and had never learned a word of English, this was not inconvenient. It was humiliating. Their own tongue, shaped by generations of African soil and Calvinist prayer, was effectively demoted in the land they considered their own. British legal reforms followed, dismantling the old frontier justice that Boer farmers had administered largely on their own terms. Missionaries arrived in growing numbers, men like John Philip of the London Missionary Society, who campaigned loudly for the rights of Khoisan laborers and challenged the brutal treatment that many Boers considered simply the natural order of things. In 1828, Ordinance 50 granted non-white inhabitants of the colony legal equality before the courts. To the Boers, this was not justice. It was revolution. Then came the blow that struck deepest of all. In 1834, Britain abolished slavery throughout the empire. The Cape Colony held roughly 36,000 enslaved people, and Boer farm owners had built their agricultural world around that labor. Compensation was offered, but it was inadequate, paid in distant London through agents who extracted heavy fees, and delivered in amounts that bore little relationship to the losses claimed. Many Boer families received almost nothing. The fury was profound and lasting. This was not simply an economic grievance. The Boers read their Bibles carefully, and they had constructed a theological justification for the racial hierarchy on which their society rested. British abolition did not merely threaten their livelihoods. It challenged their entire understanding of God's order. Resentment, already deep, was hardening into something more dangerous. Within a few years, thousands of Boer families would make a decision that changed the history of southern Africa forever. They came with everything they owned packed into ox wagons, canvas stretched tight against the African sun. From 1836 onward, thousands of Boer families made the momentous decision to leave the Cape Colony behind, to turn their backs on British rule and walk into the unknown interior of a continent that offered no guarantees and no mercy. They called themselves Voortrekkers, pioneers, those who trek ahead. What drove them was everything that had accumulated over the previous decade. The language laws, the courts, the missionaries, the compensation that never came. One Boer woman named Anna Steenkamp put it plainly in her memoirs. The abolition of slavery was not simply about money, she wrote. It was the placing of freed slaves on equal footing with Christians, contrary to the laws of God and the natural distinction of race and religion. Here was the founding grievance of a people in motion. Leaders emerged from the wagon trails. Piet Retief, a charismatic and ambitious man who believed he could negotiate with African kingdoms as an equal sovereign. Hendrik Potgieter, harder and more cautious, who pushed further north into the High Veld. Gerrit Maritz, who provided organization to what might otherwise have collapsed into chaos. These were not simple farmers. They were nation builders who did not yet have a nation. The land they crossed was not empty. The interior of southern Africa had been dramatically reshaped by the Mafeking, the great upheaval set off by the rise of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka in the 1820s. Entire peoples had been displaced, scattered, or destroyed. What the Voortrekkers found was not wilderness, but a landscape scarred by recent violence, dotted with the remnants of shattered communities and the rising power of kingdoms that had survived. The Zulu kingdom, now under King Dingaan following Shaka's assassination in 1828, was the most formidable force in the region. Piet Retief believed he could deal with Dingaan directly. In February 1838, he led a delegation to the Zulu royal kraal to negotiate a land treaty. Dingaan received them, agreed to terms, and then ordered his warriors to seize the Boer party. Retief and his men, numbering around 100, were killed to the last man. What followed was massacre. Zulu impis swept through the Voortrekker encampments on the Bluekrans River, killing over 400 men, women, and children. The survivors were left shattered, encircled, fighting for survival in a land that had just demonstrated how brutal it could be. The reckoning came on the 16th of December, 1838. A Voortrekker force of roughly 470 men, under Andries Pretorius, formed a defensive laager on the banks of a river. They had made a vow beforehand. If God granted them victory, they and their descendants would honor that day forever as a holy Sabbath. The Zulu attacked in waves. Thousands of warriors against fewer than 500 riflemen behind their wagons. When the battle ended, the river ran red. It carried the bodies of perhaps 3,000 Zulu dead. Not a single Voortrekker was killed. Blood River. The name embedded itself into Afrikaner memory like a brand. The Voortrekkers pressed on, founding the Natalia Republic around the port of Port Natal in 1839. For a brief moment, they had their dream. A sovereign republic, free of British interference, shaped by their own laws and their own God. But Britain had not forgotten them. London looked at a Boer republic controlling a strategic harbor on the Indian Ocean coast and saw a problem that needed solving. In 1845, British troops annexed Natalia. The Boers had walked hundreds of miles to escape the Empire, and the Empire had simply followed them. Many packed their wagons again and moved north, beyond the Vaal and Orange rivers, searching for the freedom that kept retreating over the next horizon. The Empire had followed them once. Now Britain made a different calculation. By the early 1850s, London had grown weary of chasing scattered Boer communities across an increasingly expensive and ungovernable frontier. Two formal agreements would define what came next, and what came next would shape the entire trajectory of Southern African history. In January 1852, British representatives met Boer leaders at Sand River in the Transvaal. The resulting convention was blunt in its intent. Britain formally recognized the right of the Boers living north of the Vaal River to manage their own affairs, govern themselves, and acquire ammunition for their defense. The empire was washing its hands of them. 2 years later, in February 1854, the Bloemfontein Convention extended the same recognition to the Boers settled between the Orange and Vaal Rivers. Two republics now existed where before there had been only contested frontier. What kind of republics were they? The Transvaal, which would eventually formalize itself as the South African Republic, was a rough and sprawling place, its authority barely reaching across the vast high veld distances. Governance fell to the Volksraad, a legislative assembly of adult male Boer citizens whose debates could be passionate, fractious, and occasionally inconclusive. The Orange Free State was more compact and better organized, developing a functioning constitutional government that some observers considered among the more orderly political structures in the region. Both societies were built around the farm, the family, the congregation, and the rifle. The Dutch Reformed Church sat at the heart of community life, providing not just spiritual authority, but the intellectual framework through which Boers understood their place in the world. They were a chosen people. This land had been given to them through suffering and divine favor, and no external power had the right to take it back. But the land was not theirs alone to shape. African kingdoms and communities surrounded and interpenetrated these new republics at every border. The Sotho kingdom under the shrewd and resilient Moshoeshoe maintained its independence in the mountain country to the east. Tswana and Pedi communities occupied territories the Boers coveted. Relations were rarely simple. Trade, diplomacy, conflict, and coercion all existed simultaneously. Labor was the sharpest edge of this relationship. The Boer republics formally prohibited slavery, a condition of their recognition by Britain. But a system of bound labor, apprenticeships, and debt tied black Africans to white farms and arrangements that differed from slavery more in name than in daily experience. African children captured during frontier conflicts were placed in Boer households as indentured workers. The ideology that the Voortrekkers had carried out of the Cape, the belief in a natural and God-ordained hierarchy, had simply found new institutional forms. By the late 1850s, a fragile equilibrium held across the southern African interior. The republics existed, they governed, and they endured. But beneath the surface, pressures were building that no convention and no frontier could contain for long. In 1867, a child found something glittering in the dirt near the Orange River, and the equilibrium shattered forever. That glittering stone found near the Orange River in 1867 would prove to be one of the most consequential geological accidents in human history. It was a 15-carat diamond identified by mineralogist Dr. W.G. Atherstone and eventually purchased by the Cape Colony's governor. The find seemed almost impossibly fortunate. What followed seemed almost impossibly fast. Within months, prospectors were flooding into the dry, scrubby landscape around the junction of the Vaal and Orange rivers. By 1870, a full-scale diamond rush was underway, and within 2 years, the settlement that became Kimberley was home to tens of thousands of fortune seekers from Britain, America, Australia, and across the continent. The hole they dug into the earth, a single volcanic pipe of extraordinary diamond-bearing ore, would eventually become the largest man-made excavation in history. The Boers who held nominal claim over this territory watched the transformation with bewildered unease. The ground had always been poor, fit mainly for livestock and hard living. Now it was drawing the world to their doorstep. Britain drew its own conclusions quickly. In 1871, London annexed Griqualand West, the territory surrounding the diamond fields, absorbing it into the empire and sweeping aside Boer and Griqua claims alike. The justification was thin. The intention was transparent. Where extraordinary wealth appeared, British sovereignty had a way of appearing alongside it. The Boer republics had been left alone precisely because they seemed to offer nothing worth taking. That calculation was already obsolete. But Kimberley was only the overture. In 1886, a prospector named George Harrison discovered gold-bearing rock on a farm called Langlaagte on the Witwatersrand Ridge just south of Pretoria. The reef he had stumbled upon extended for nearly 40 miles and ran deep into the earth. Geologists would eventually confirm what early assays suggested. This was the single richest gold deposit the world had ever seen. The Transvaal, that rough and struggling republic, was sitting on the greatest concentration of mineral wealth on the African continent. The transformation was staggering in its speed. Within a decade, Johannesburg grew from a canvas tent encampment into a roaring city of over 100,000 people. Banks, stock exchanges, brothels, churches, and newspapers all appeared almost simultaneously. The noise was constant, the dust was perpetual, and the money moved in rivers. The newcomers flooding into the Transvaal were called Uitlanders, a simple Afrikaans word meaning foreigners. By the early 1890s, they may well have outnumbered the Boer population of the Republic itself. They came for the gold, they stayed for the money, and they brought with them the appetites, assumptions, and ambitions of industrial capitalism. They wanted political representation. They wanted property rights. They wanted the Transvaal reshaped in a form more congenial to their interests. President Paul Kruger of the South African Republic watched all of this with deep suspicion, and his suspicion was entirely rational. He restricted Uitlander voting rights, imposed heavy taxes on the mining industry, and maintained tight state control over critical infrastructure. He understood, with remarkable clarity, that granting these men political power would mean surrendering his republic to them. Into this volatile atmosphere walked Cecil Rhodes. Already wealthy beyond most men's imagination from his Kimberley diamond holdings, Rhodes had methodically consolidated the fractured diamond industry into a single company, De Beers, which by 1888 controlled 90% of the world's diamond production. He was 35 years old, Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and possessed by a vision of British dominion stretching from the Cape to Cairo. The Transvaal's gold stood directly in the path of that vision. Rhodes could not leave it in Kruger's hands. He began funding Uitlander grievance organizations, cultivating political allies, and dreaming of schemes that would transfer the Republic's wealth into imperial hands without the inconvenience of a formal war. The Boers had sought only to be left alone. The earth beneath their feet had made that impossible. What came next would test whether diplomacy or violence would decide who truly owned Southern Africa. The British government had watched the Transvaal struggles with something close to contempt. The Republic was perpetually broke, perpetually threatened by its neighbors, and perpetually incapable of maintaining order along its frontiers. In London's imperial calculus, this made it ripe for absorption. In 1877, Sir Theophilus Shepstone arrived in Pretoria carrying letters of authority from the Colonial Office. A veteran administrator with long experience managing African affairs in Natal, Shepstone was smooth, patient, and utterly certain of Britain's civilizing mission. He told the Transvaal's government that annexation was the only path to solvency and security. After minimal resistance, the Transvaal's flag came down on April 12, 1877. British sovereignty was declared almost without a shot fired. The Boers had not consented. They had simply been too weak, too divided, and too exhausted to resist. But weakness is not the same as acceptance. For 3 years, Boer leaders including Paul Kruger traveled to London to petition for restoration of their independence. They were politely received and firmly refused. The discovery of gold deposits in the eastern Transvaal had only sharpened British interest in holding the territory. Petitions turned to frustration. Frustration hardened into fury. In December 1880, the fury finally broke into open rebellion. Boer commandos laid siege to British garrisons scattered across the Transvaal. At Bronkhorstspruit on December 20th, a British column marching in parade formation was ambushed and nearly annihilated within minutes. The Boers were not fighting like the enemies British officers had faced before. They moved through the landscape like part of it, using kopjes and ridgelines and the peculiar African light to devastating advantage. General Sir George Colley, commanding British forces in Natal, moved to relieve the besieged garrisons. He was a talented officer by the standards of his age, educated, decorated, and entirely unprepared for what he was walking into. Majuba Hill rose roughly 2,000 feet above the surrounding plain, commanding the pass that connected Natal to the Transvaal. On the night of February 26, 1881, Colley led roughly 360 men up its slopes in darkness. By dawn, he held the summit and believed himself invulnerable. He was catastrophically wrong. The Boers looked up at the silhouetted figures on the hilltop and began to climb. They moved in small groups, using every rock and fold of ground for cover, advancing in silence and with extraordinary discipline. British soldiers peering over the rim found themselves facing marksmen who seemed almost invisible. Within hours, the Boers crested the summit. The British broke and ran. Colley himself was shot and killed. 92 men were killed or wounded, and the remainder surrendered or fled down the hillside. The battle had lasted barely an hour. The shock in Britain was profound. A modern imperial army, with all the prestige and machinery of the world's greatest empire, had been routed by farmers. Prime Minister William Gladstone, already philosophically skeptical of aggressive imperial expansion, chose not to send reinforcements. He negotiated instead. The Pretoria Convention of 1881 restored internal self-government to the Transvaal, though Britain retained a vague and disputed claim to suzerainty over its foreign affairs. Kruger declared it a victory. Many British officers declared it a disgrace. They were not wrong that something had been left unresolved. Majuba Hill lodged itself into the memory of British imperial culture like a splinter. It would be cited in drawing rooms and regimental messes for 20 years. When the next crisis came, some men would reach for diplomacy. Others would remember only the humiliation and demand that the account be settled. The splinter would not be removed cheaply, and the tensions that made Majuba possible, the gold, the Uitlanders, the irreconcilable ambitions of Kruger and Rhodes, were already pulling southern Africa towards something far larger. Paul Kruger was not a man who trusted easily, and he had learned not to trust the British at all. Born on the Cape frontier in 1825, he had trekked into the interior as a child, fought his first battles as a teenager, and spent the better part of 6 decades watching the empire encroach, negotiate, encroach again. He was broad-shouldered, deeply religious, and possessed of a political cunning that his enemies persistently mistook for mere stubbornness. He read the Bible as literal truth and governed the Transvaal as a republic chosen by God to preserve a way of life that the modern world seemed determined to destroy. What the modern world sent in the years after Majuba was gold. The Witwatersrand Reef, confirmed in 1886, was among the richest deposits ever discovered. Within years, Johannesburg had erupted from empty grassland into a roaring industrial city. The men who came to work its mines, operate its exchanges, and supply its labor camps were overwhelmingly British. By the mid-1890s, the Uitlanders, the Afrikaans word simply meaning foreigners, may have outnumbered the Boers in the Transvaal itself. Kruger saw the numbers clearly. If these men were granted the vote, they would vote him out of existence. His republic, built on generations of sacrifice and separation, would be absorbed not by British soldiers this time, but by British ballots. He refused to extend full citizenship rights, requiring 14 years of residency before any Uitlander could apply for the franchise. In practice, almost none ever qualified. The grievance that followed was genuine, even if the men who would exploit it were not. The Uitlanders paid the majority of the Transvaal's taxes. They funded the railways, the dynamite monopolies, and the state revenues. They received almost nothing in return except the right to be taxed again. No vote. No representation. No meaningful voice in the laws that govern their working conditions, their property, or their lives. In 1895, a formal petition carrying the signatures of thousands of Uitlander residents was dispatched to Queen Victoria herself. The language was measured, but the complaint was ancient, the same complaint that had ignited revolutions before. They were being governed without their consent. They were subjects without rights. In London and Cape Town, men like Cecil Rhodes read those signatures with something other than sympathy. Rhodes, the mining magnate and Cape Colony Prime Minister, had built a fortune on Witwatersrand gold and harbored visions of a British Africa stretching uninterrupted from the Cape to Cairo. For Rhodes, the Uitlander grievance was not a humanitarian cause. It was a lever, a justification, the kind of popular suffering that could make intervention look like rescue. Kruger understood this completely. Every concession he refused was not simply stubbornness but strategy. To open the franchise was to surrender the Republic. To keep it closed was to hand his enemies a cause. There was no clean exit from the trap. He could only delay, maneuver, and hope that the Empire's attention would turn elsewhere. It would not. The gold fields of the Witwatersrand were producing wealth on a scale that made the Transvaal the most financially significant territory in Africa, and the men who controlled British imperial policy had no intention of leaving that wealth inside a Boer republic. The petition to Queen Victoria went unanswered in any meaningful sense. The Uitlanders remained unrepresented. And just months after those signatures were collected, a small column of armed men would ride across the Transvaal border in an act of reckless conspiracy that would shake the British Empire, ruin one of its most powerful figures, and push southern Africa one final, irreversible step toward war. The man riding at the head of that column was not Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was too careful, too powerful, too much the architect to risk himself in the field. That work fell to Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, a physician turned administrator who combined genuine personal courage with a catastrophic indifference to careful planning. On the 29th of December 1895, Jameson led roughly 500 men across the border from Bechuanaland into the Transvaal, expecting to ignite a revolution. The plan had seemed elegant in conception. Rhodes, working through a network of Johannesburg mining executives called the Reform Committee, believed the Uitlanders were ready to rise. Arms had been smuggled into the city. A coordinating signal had been arranged. Jameson's column would ride hard for Johannesburg. The Uitlanders would seize key buildings, and the Transvaal government would collapse under the weight of its own illegitimacy. Britain would step in to restore order, and order would look remarkably like annexation. Cape to Cairo, built on a single weekend's audacity. What Rhodes had not accounted for was hesitation, incompetence, and a Boer intelligence network that already knew the raid was coming. The Reform Committee fractured over the timing. Messages went unanswered. The coordinated uprising never materialized. Jameson, receiving only confusion from Johannesburg, chose to ride anyway. It was the decision of a man who believed boldness could substitute for preparation. It could not. Boer commandos tracked the column from the moment it crossed the border. The raiders were tired, poorly supplied, and riding through territory where every farmhouse was a potential enemy observation post. By the 2nd of January 1896, Jameson's force was surrounded near Doornkop, within sight of Johannesburg's mine headgear. After a brief, lopsided engagement, he surrendered. The entire enterprise had lasted less than 5 days. The embarrassment that followed was total. Jameson and his officers were handed over to British authorities and eventually tried in London. The Reform Committee leaders in Johannesburg were arrested by Kruger's government, tried for treason, and sentenced to death before those sentences were commuted to fines and imprisonment. Rhodes, his fingerprints unmistakably on every aspect of the conspiracy, was forced to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. The dream of a British Africa stitched together by cunning and speed lay in ruins. Then came the telegram that turned embarrassment into crisis. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent a personal congratulatory message to Paul Kruger, praising the Boer president for repelling the raiders without requiring assistance from any friendly power. The implication was deliberate and unmistakable. Germany was watching. Germany sympathized with the Boers. Britain's room to maneuver was not unlimited. The telegram caused outrage in London and made Kruger briefly a celebrated figure across Europe. For the Boer republics, the lessons of Doornkop were absorbed quickly and practically. Kruger accelerated the Transvaal's military preparations. Modern artillery was ordered from European manufacturers. The alliance with the Orange Free State was strengthened. Where before there had been suspicion of British intentions, there was now certainty. If London's most powerful colonial operator had been willing to sponsor an armed invasion in peacetime, what would happen when the next pretext arrived? The Jameson Raid did not start the Boer War, but it guaranteed the war's character. It stripped away the pretense that British grievances in the Transvaal were purely humanitarian. It hardened Boer resolve into something approaching military confidence. And it removed from the chessboard the one man subtle enough to have perhaps found another path forward. With Rhodes disgraced and Kruger rearming, a new and far more dangerous player was preparing to take the stage in Pretoria and London alike. Into this charged atmosphere stepped a man who would make Rhodes look almost restrained. Sir Alfred Milner arrived in Cape Town in May of 1897 as Britain's new High Commissioner for Southern Africa, and from the moment he set foot on the continent, he carried a conclusion already formed. The Transvaal, in his view, was an obstacle to be removed, not a problem to be managed. Milner was not a soldier or an adventurer. He was something in many ways more dangerous, a brilliant, cold-eyed administrator whose imperialism was ideological rather than opportunistic. Oxford educated, a former journalist and tax reformer, he believed with genuine conviction that British racial and cultural supremacy was both inevitable and morally necessary. The Boer republics sitting at the heart of southern Africa were, to his mind, an affront to the natural order of history. Boer, he came to believe very quickly, was not something to be avoided. It was something to be arranged. His partner in London was equally formidable. Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary, was a self-made Birmingham industrialist who had transformed himself into the most aggressive advocate for British imperial expansion in government. Where Milner provided the intellectual architecture, Chamberlain supplied the political will and the patronage. Together, they formed a partnership aimed at forcing a confrontation that more cautious men might have sidestepped. The chosen instrument was the Uitlander grievance. The tens of thousands of mostly British miners and entrepreneurs living in the Transvaal remained, in Kruger's republic, political non-citizens. They paid taxes, drove the economy, and outnumbered the Boers in the Rand's industrial corridors, yet Kruger's franchise laws kept them from voting. For Milner, this was not merely an injustice, but a gift. A genuine humanitarian cause that could dress strategic ambition in respectable clothing. In May of 1899, the two sides met at Bloemfontein, capital of the Orange Free State, in a conference that represented the last genuine opportunity to prevent war. Kruger arrived willing to negotiate. He offered a 5-year retrospective franchise for Uitlanders, a concession that, while limited, was real. But Milner had not come to negotiate. He pushed his demands higher with each session, insisting on a 7-year franchise, then tightening conditions that made even sympathetic observers uneasy. After 9 days of talks that generated far more heat than progress, Milner walked away. He described the conference privately as exactly what he had intended it to be, a demonstration that no settlement was possible. What followed was a masterpiece of manipulative framing. Milner sent London what became known as the Helot Dispatch, a lengthy communication describing the Uitlanders as a subject population living under conditions of political servitude comparable to ancient slavery. The language was deliberately incendiary. Thousands of British subjects were ground beneath the heel of an oligarchic republic, he wrote. Britain could no longer stand aside. The dispatch worked. Public opinion in Britain, already primed by years of press coverage portraying Kruger as a stubborn reactionary, shifted further toward intervention. Meanwhile, both sides prepared for what increasingly seemed inevitable. The Transvaal, using its extraordinary gold revenues, had spent years importing Krupp artillery from Germany, Mauser rifles from continental suppliers, and ammunition stockpiled in quantities that alarmed British military planners. The Orange Free State honored its alliance and began its own preparations. Britain, belatedly recognizing the scale of what it might be facing, began shipping reinforcements to Natal and the Cape. Through the Southern Hemisphere winter of 1899, diplomacy continued in form while dying in substance. Ultimatums were drafted and redrafted. Both governments knew the arithmetic of the situation, and neither flinched from it. On the 9th of October, 1899, Kruger ended the uncertainty. The Transvaal issued its own ultimatum to Britain, demanding the withdrawal of all troops from its borders within 48 hours. It was a document that surprised almost everyone by its directness, and it handed Milner everything he had worked toward. The ultimatum expired unanswered. Within days, Boer commandos were crossing the borders of Natal and The ultimatum expired at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 11th of October, 1899. There was no reply from London. There was never going to be one. In British drawing rooms and newspaper offices, the reaction was something close to contempt mixed with relief. Contempt, because a small pastoral republic of perhaps 80,000 fighting men had dared to issue demands to the greatest empire the world had ever known. Relief, because the waiting was finally over. The British press, almost unanimously, predicted a swift and satisfying correction. Soldiers would be in Pretoria by Christmas. The whole affair, many assumed, would last no more than a few weeks. It was a spectacular miscalculation, and the Boers wasted no time demonstrating why. The Boer military was unlike anything Britain had faced in recent memory. There were no barracks, no parade grounds, no regimental colors. The fighting force of the republics was built on the commando system, a tradition stretching back generations to the frontier wars of the Cape. Every Boer male between the ages of 16 and 60 was liable for service. They brought their own horses, their own supplies, and their own rifles. Those rifles were almost universally the German Mauser, a magazine-fed weapon accurate at ranges that left British soldiers stunned. These were not reluctant conscripts. They were men who had grown up on horseback, who could read terrain by instinct, and who had been hunting since childhood. The Orange Free State, honoring its treaty with the Transvaal, entered the war immediately alongside its northern neighbor. President Marthinus Steen had hoped for peace but prepared for the alternative, and his republic's commandos were disciplined, well-armed, and deeply motivated. The combined Boer forces numbered somewhere around 50,000 men in the field. Britain had fewer than 15,000 troops in all of southern Africa when the war began. The the Boers struck simultaneously on two fronts. In the east, Transvaal forces poured across the border into Natal, heading south toward the critical rail junction at Ladysmith. Speed and surprise were their weapons. British garrisons, caught under strength and unprepared, fell back under pressure. In the west, Free State and Transvaal commandos crossed into the northern Cape Colony, threatening to sweep through territory Britain had held for nearly a century and pulling in Cape Boers who might sympathize with their Republican cousins. Within days, the geography of the war took on a shape that London had not anticipated. The Boers were not waiting to be attacked. They were seizing the initiative, occupying high ground, cutting rail lines, and surrounding British forces before reinforcements could arrive. The towns of Kimberley and Mafeking in the Cape were placed under siege. In Natal, events moved toward a confrontation at Ladysmith that would pin down a significant British force for months. The easy confidence of October's first days began to dissolve with uncomfortable speed. What Britain had imagined as a policing exercise was revealing itself as something far more serious. The enemy knew the land, moved without supply trains, and fought from cover with terrifying accuracy. The open veldt that British commanders had assumed would favor conventional maneuver instead became a killing ground for soldiers trained in European-style warfare against an enemy who refused to stand still and be defeated properly. The war that Milner had engineered, the war that Chamberlain had enabled, and the war that British public opinion had greeted with such breezy confidence was now fully, bloodily underway. And in those first October weeks, it was the Boers who held the advantage. How long they could hold it and what Britain would do to reverse it would define the terrible months ahead. By November of 1899, 3 British towns were under siege simultaneously, and the shape of the war had become something entirely unexpected. The Boers had not simply advanced and retreated. They had encircled, and they were waiting. Ladysmith, in the rolling hills of Natal, held the largest trapped force. General Sir George White had withdrawn his battered command inside the town's perimeter after a series of sharp reverses, and approximately 13,000 soldiers found themselves surrounded. The Boer guns, hauled into the surrounding heights with extraordinary effort, began shelling the town with methodical patience. Weeks passed. Then months. Inside the perimeter, horses were slaughtered for food, dysentery spread through the camps, and men weakened not from battle wounds but from slow starvation and the particular misery of waiting without knowing when or whether relief would come. Kimberley presented a different kind of crisis. The Diamond City held military significance, but it also contained Cecil Rhodes, the mining magnate whose imperial ambitions had done so much to bring the war about in the first place. Rhodes, now trapped inside the very territory his scheming had helped destabilize, proved a difficult prisoner of circumstance. He harangued the military commander, Colonel Robert Kekewich, with constant demands for more aggressive action and sent increasingly frantic messages to Cape Town warning of disaster if rescue did not come quickly. The siege of Kimberley was, in its way, a portrait of imperial hubris forced to confront its own consequences. The great architect of expansion, penned inside a diamond town, dependent on soldiers he could not command. Then there was Mafeking. The small railroad town on the northern Cape frontier should have been a footnote. Instead, it became the most famous siege in the world. Colonel Robert Baden-Powell, commanding roughly 1,200 soldiers and perhaps 7,000 civilians, organized Mafeking's defense with a theatrical ingenuity that captured imaginations far beyond the veldt. He bluffed, improvised, and stage-managed. He had dummy minefields laid and fake dispatch riders sent to suggest strength the garrison did not possess. He organized concerts and sports days to maintain morale. He rationed food with increasing severity as the weeks stretched into months, and the town endured 217 days of siege in total. What none of the triumphant newspaper coverage mentioned at the time was the fate of Mafeking's black African residents. Baden-Powell's rationing system treated them as a lower priority, and many experienced genuine hunger, while the garrison's white population managed on reduced but survivable rations. The siege that Britain celebrated most loudly contained within it a hierarchy of suffering that would not be examined honestly for decades. Across all three towns, the conditions converged toward the same grim realities: sporadic bombardment, shrinking food supplies, disease moving through weakened populations, and an uncertainty that proved as corrosive as any physical hardship. For the British Empire, the propaganda effect was devastating. Three garrisons, helpless, waiting to be rescued, their plight splashed across newspapers from London to Sydney. The empire that had proclaimed its civilizing mission across the globe could not, in the first weeks of a war against two small republics, keep its own soldiers free. The world was watching, and what it saw was not the image Britain wished to project. Something would have to change. Britain would have to mobilize on a scale it had not contemplated when October's easy confidence filled the drawing rooms. New commanders, new troops, and a new reckoning with the nature of the enemy were all on their way. The question was whether they would arrive in time. 5 days into December of 1899, the British High Command still believed the sieges could be broken quickly. Within 10 days, that belief would lie in ruins alongside hundreds of dead soldiers scattered across the South African veldt. The catastrophe began at Stormberg on December the 10th. General William Gattaker, commanding British forces in the Northern Cape Colony, led a night march intended to surprise a Boer position. His guides lost the way. His exhausted troops stumbled through darkness, arrived late, and were caught in the open below the Boer-held ridge as dawn broke. The Boers fired down from commanding positions with devastating accuracy. Gattaker retreated, having lost nearly 700 men, including over 500 captured. It was a humiliation, but it was merely the opening act. The following morning brought something far worse. At Magersfontein, General Lord Methuen commanded the relief column pushing toward besieged Kimberley. His plan was straightforward: a heavy artillery bombardment followed by an infantry advance. The Highland Brigade, some of the finest soldiers in the British Army, would lead the assault. What Methuen did not know was that the Boer commander Piet Cronje had made a decision of quiet genius. Instead of defending the obvious hilltop positions the British artillery was shelling, Cronje ordered his men to dig concealed trenches at the very base of the hills, in the darkness where the slope met the flat ground. The Highlanders advanced in the pre-dawn blackness, packed tightly together in formation, and walked directly into the Boer rifle line. The volleys that erupted were point-blank, murderous, and completely unexpected. Men fell in rows. The survivors pressed into the scrub and lay pinned for hours beneath the South African sun, unable to advance or retreat. By the time the battle ended, nearly 900 British soldiers were dead or wounded. Among the dead was Major General Andrew Wauchope, the Highland Brigade's commander, shot within seconds of the first volley. The Highland Brigade, storied and proud, had been effectively destroyed in a single morning. 4 days later, on December the 15th, General Redvers Buller attempted to cross the Tugela River at Colenso to relieve Ladysmith. Buller commanded over 20,000 men. Facing him was Louis Botha, just 37 years old, commanding perhaps 8,000 Boers who had turned the northern bank of the Tugela into an invisible fortress. When the British advanced, they discovered the Boers had concealed their positions with extraordinary skill. 2 batteries of artillery, pushing forward aggressively, found themselves trapped under fire. The attempt to save the guns cost additional lives. By afternoon, Buller ordered withdrawal. British casualties numbered over 1,000. He telegraphed London with advice that Ladysmith should consider surrender. 3 battles. 3 defeats. 5 days. The world had a name for it almost immediately: Black Week. The shock that rippled through the British Empire was unlike anything since the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Newspapers that had promised a swift colonial adventure now confronted headlines that read as catastrophe. Stock markets trembled. European powers, already skeptical of British claims to moral leadership, observed with barely concealed satisfaction. In London, Queen Victoria, now 80 years old and failing in health, reportedly said, "We are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist, but they did exist, and everyone knew it." Why had the Boers succeeded so completely? The answers were visible in every engagement. These were men who had hunted game across the veldt their entire lives, who carried modern Mauser rifles capable of lethal accuracy at ranges that rendered British tactical formations suicidal. They fought from concealment, used terrain as a weapon, and refused the set-piece battles that British doctrine demanded. Britain's response was swift and enormous. Field Marshal Lord Roberts was appointed Supreme Commander, with General Kitchener as his Chief of Staff. Reinforcements numbering in the tens of thousands were mobilized and dispatched. The Empire was no longer sending a punitive expedition. It was sending an army. What that army would face, and what methods it would ultimately employ to secure victory, would define not just the war's outcome, but its legacy. Field Marshal Frederick Sly Roberts arrived in Cape Town on the 10th of January, 1900, and nothing about the British war effort would ever be the same. Small in stature, 67 years old, and carrying the grief of a father who had just lost his son at Colenso, Roberts brought with him something the campaign had sorely lacked: a commander who understood both the scale of the problem and the patience required to solve it. His appointment had come directly from the disaster of Black Week. The War Office in London, shaken and embarrassed, had turned to the most decorated soldier in the Empire. Roberts had won the Victoria Cross in India, pacified Afghanistan, and marched his army from Kabul to Kandahar in one of the 19th century's legendary military feats. If anyone could reverse the tide in South Africa, it was him. Beside Roberts came Herbert Kitchener, the Iron Administrator who had crushed the Mahadist forces at Omdurman less than 2 years earlier. Where Roberts supplied the strategic vision, Kitchener supplied the engine. He threw himself into the chaos of British logistics with terrifying efficiency, reorganizing supply lines, clearing bottlenecks, and imposing order on a military machine that had been lurching forward on improvisation and hope. Soldiers who had waited weeks for basic supplies began receiving them. The army began to breathe again. And it was a much larger army now. Volunteers had flooded recruitment offices across the Empire the moment Black Week's headlines landed. Canada sent contingents. Australia dispatched mounted infantry particularly suited to the open veldt. New Zealand contributed riflemen. From India came cavalry and support units. The total reinforcements pushed British strength in South Africa past 180,000 men, transforming what had begun as a colonial police action into one of the largest military deployments in British history to that point. Roberts studied the strategic situation and arrived at a conclusion that differed fundamentally from his predecessors. The previous commanders had advanced predictably, along obvious routes, into prepared Boer defensive positions. The result had been Black Week. Roberts intended to use his numerical advantage and superior cavalry to execute wide flanking movements, sweeping around Boer lines rather than battering through them. Speed and deception would replace frontal assault. The first great test of this new approach came in mid-February. The Diamond City of Kimberley had been under siege since October, its garrison and civilian population slowly exhausted by months of Boer encirclement. Cecil Rhodes himself was trapped inside, his impatience and demands for relief having become a source of considerable irritation to British commanders. Roberts assigned the relief mission to General John French, commanding the largest cavalry force Britain had assembled in decades. On the 12th of February, French's cavalry began their advance. Over the following days, they drove south and west across the open veldt in a sweeping arc that caught the Boer besieging forces by surprise. The movement was rapid, relentless, and precisely the kind of warfare the veldt favored when executed boldly. On the 15th of February, 1900, French's horsemen thundered into Kimberley. The siege was over after 124 days. The relief was greeted with scenes of genuine jubilation among a population weakened by hunger and months of confinement. The relief of Kimberley was more than symbolic. It announced to the Boers and to watching powers across Europe that the British had learned from their earlier failures. A new commander, a reorganized army, and a new strategic doctrine had produced results within weeks of their implementation. But the Boers had not broken, and one of their finest commanders, Piet Cronje, was now caught between converging British columns near the Modder River, fighting desperately to escape. The trap was closing. Piet Cronje knew the net was tightening. With French's cavalry now free from Kimberley and Roberts' infantry pressing hard from multiple directions, the Boer general faced an impossible choice: abandon his wagons and flee with whatever speed his men could manage, or stand and fight. He chose neither cleanly, and that hesitation would cost him everything. Cronje's column, burdened with wagons, women, and the accumulated supplies of a besieging army, moved too slowly across the open veldt toward the Modder River. Roberts had anticipated this. His orders were urgent and precise. The cavalry, still flushed from their Kimberley triumph, rode hard to cut Cronje off before he could reach the safety of Bloemfontein. By the 18th of February, 1900, British forces had encircled approximately 4,000 Boers in a laager at Paardeberg Drift. The trap had closed. What followed next remains one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. Kitchener, temporarily in command while Roberts recovered from illness, refused to wait. He ordered a direct frontal assault on the Boer positions. His subordinate commanders advised against it. The laager sat in a natural defensive hollow along the river, and the Boers, who had spent years learning to use cover and concealment, were exceptionally positioned. the warnings were ignored. On the 18th of February, wave after wave of British infantry advanced across open ground toward the entrenched Boer riflemen. The results were predictable and brutal. By nightfall, the British had suffered nearly 1,300 casualties and gained nothing of tactical value. The men who fell that day died not because of Boer brilliance, but because of a commander's impatience. It was, in miniature, everything Roberts had come to South Africa to prevent. Roberts resumed command the following day and immediately changed course. There would be no more frontal assaults. Instead, the British tightened their cordon and brought their artillery to bear. For 10 days, shells rained down on the Boer laager with methodical persistence. The camp became a hellish, shrinking world of dead horses, wounded men, and churned earth. The smell carried for miles across the veldt. Cronje appealed to his fellow commanders for relief, but no rescue came. The British ring held. Inside the laager, conditions deteriorated by the hour. Water from the river, contaminated by the bodies of dead animals upstream, spread disease through the camp. Ammunition ran low. The wounded lay in improvised shelters while shells continued to fall. Still, Cronje refused to surrender. His stubbornness was, in a strange way, a final act of defiance from an older Boer tradition that valued endurance above calculation. But endurance had its limits. On the 27th of February 1900, Piet Cronje raised the white flag and surrendered with approximately 4,000 men. The date was not lost on anyone present. It was Majuba Day, the 19th anniversary of the humiliating British defeat at Majuba Hill that had ended the First Boer War. The symbolism was intoxicating for the British public, who received the news with an eruption of patriotic celebration. The humiliation of Majuba had been answered at last on the very anniversary of the original wound. The following day brought further cause for relief. On the 28th of February, General Buller's forces finally broke through to Ladysmith after months of failed attempts. The siege that had become a symbol of British suffering in this war was over. The town's exhausted garrison and civilian population emerged into a changed world. Within the span of 2 weeks, Kimberley had been relieved, Ladysmith had been freed, and 4,000 Boers had surrendered. The tide had turned, visibly and dramatically. But in Pretoria and across the veldt, the Boer leadership was already drawing a different conclusion. Conventional warfare had failed them, and a new kind of war was about to begin. The road to Bloemfontein lay open, and Roberts wasted no time walking it. On the 13th of March 1900, British troops marched into the capital of the Orange Free State without a shot fired. The city's residents watched from doorways and stoops as column after column of khaki-clad soldiers filled the wide, dusty streets. For Roberts, it was a moment of quiet triumph. For the Boer leadership, it was a humiliation they had not yet learned to accept. But Bloemfontein would prove to be a trap of a different kind. The army that marched in was already carrying the seeds of a catastrophe. Contaminated water supplies, accumulated exhaustion from weeks of hard marching, and a breakdown in the supply chain created perfect conditions for disease. Typhoid swept through the British camps with ferocious efficiency. Within weeks, thousands of soldiers lay sick in makeshift hospitals throughout the city. More British troops would die from typhoid in Bloemfontein than had fallen to Boer bullets at Paardeberg. The army sat, suffered, and waited for 6 weeks while Roberts struggled to restore his supply lines and his fighting strength. It was a pause the Boers used well. Across the veldt, commanders like Christian de Wet watched the British consolidation with calculating eyes. Something new was forming in their thinking, though its full consequences remained months away. Roberts resumed his advance in May. His objective was clear: capture the great industrial prize of Johannesburg and then Pretoria, the administrative heart of the Transvaal. The Boer forces, unwilling and unable to contest the advance in conventional battle, gave way. On the 31st of May, 1900, Johannesburg fell. Its gold mines, the very object that had brought Britain to this war in the first place, passed into British hands largely intact. 5 days later, on the 5th of June, Roberts rode into Pretoria. The Union Jack was raised over the government buildings. Crowds of British residents and prisoners, freed from months of captivity, cheered from the roadsides. It had the feeling of a war ending. Roberts believed it was. He proceeded to issue annexation proclamations for both republics. The Orange Free State became the Orange River Colony. The Transvaal was absorbed into the British Empire. In London, church bells rang and newspapers declared victory. The Boer republics that had defied the world's greatest empire had been erased from the map, at least on paper. Roberts was utterly convinced the fighting was essentially finished. Scattered resistance would mop itself up. He began planning his return to England. President Paul Kruger had already fled into exile in Europe, and without capitals, without formal armies, what could the Boers possibly do? The answer was already being demonstrated across thousands of square miles of open veldt, where small, fast-moving Boer commandos were refusing to accept that the war was over. The guerrilla phase had begun, and Britain had no idea what it had just walked into. They had no capitals left to defend, no formal armies to maneuver, no supply depots, no heavy artillery, no conventional war left to fight. And yet, gathered in urgent councils across the High Veldt in the weeks following Pretoria's fall, the Boer commanders made a decision that would reshape the entire nature of the conflict. They would not surrender. They would simply change the rules. It was not a retreat born of desperation. It was a calculated transformation, and the men who led it were among the most gifted irregular commanders of their era. Louis Botha, just 37 years old, possessed a rare combination of political intelligence and battlefield instinct. Where others saw defeat, he saw opportunity and mobility. Christian de Wet was something altogether more elemental, a restless, driven man who seemed to thrive on the chaos of pursuit and evasion. His energy was almost supernatural. British commanders would spend months chasing him across hundreds of miles of open country, never quite closing the trap. Koos de la Rey, commanding in the Western Transvaal, brought a quiet, methodical brilliance to the business of ambush and disappearance. And a young Cape Colony lawyer named Jan Smuts would eventually lead a raiding column deep into British territory itself, a feat that seemed almost impossible on paper. Together, these men commanded what amounted to a nation on horseback. The tactics they employed were devastatingly simple and devastatingly effective. A commando unit of perhaps 100 men would materialize from the veldt, strike a railway line, destroy a bridge or derail a supply train, and vanish before a relief column could arrive. Convoys were ambushed on lonely roads between kopjes. Isolated British garrisons, strung out across vast distances to maintain order, found themselves attacked in the dead of night by men who knew every fold and hollow of the land. Boers carried only what their horses could bear, lived off the country, and melted back into the landscape with a fluency that maddened their pursuers. The veldt itself was their greatest ally. This was not the neat, bounded countryside of European warfare. The South African interior stretched for hundreds of thousands of square miles, a rolling, semi-arid expanse broken by rocky ridges, dried riverbeds, and small farming homesteads scattered impossibly far apart. There were no roads worthy of the name in most areas. British columns, dragging supply wagons and artillery through deep dust or sudden mud, moved at a fraction of the speed of mounted Boers traveling light. The commandos knew where the water holes were, which farms could provide fresh horses, which tracks crossed which ridges unseen. The British, by contrast, were often operating on maps that proved useless or simply wrong. Roberts had structured his occupation around a garrison system, placing troops in the towns and along the railway lines that formed the empire's arteries through the region. It was precisely the kind of fixed, predictable defensive posture that guerrilla warfare was designed to exploit. A garrison that must stay cannot pursue. A railway that must be protected at every point along its length cannot be adequately protected at any one point. De Wet understood this with perfect clarity, and he acted on it relentlessly. By late 1900, British frustration was mounting into something approaching fury. Columns were dispatched to sweep the veldt clean of commandos. They swept enormous distances and found almost nothing, arriving at locations the Boers had vacated hours before. Proclamations were issued promising clemency to those who surrendered. Small numbers came in. The majority did not. Roberts sailed for home in November, handing command to Lord Kitchener and leaving behind a problem he had genuinely believed was nearly solved. It was not nearly solved. It had barely begun. The British Empire, master of the most powerful military machine in the world, was being run ragged across an African plateau by a few thousand farmers on horseback. Something more drastic would have to be tried, and what Kitchener would reach for next would prove to be the most controversial chapter of the entire war. Lord Kitchener was not a man given to sentiment. The hero of Omdurman, the conqueror of Sudan, he brought to South Africa the same cold, engineering logic he applied to every problem. Where Roberts had spoken of leniency and rapid resolution, Kitchener looked at his maps and saw a mathematical puzzle. Boer commandos required food, horses, shelter, and information. Remove those things systematically, and the guerrillas would wither and die like plants torn from the soil. In November 1900, he assumed sole command and immediately set about redesigning the entire war. The first instrument of his strategy was fire. Across the Transvaal and Orange River colony, British columns fanned out under orders to destroy everything that could sustain a fighting man in the field. Farmsteads were torched one by one, their thatched roofs catching quickly in the dry air, orange flames visible for miles across the flat veldt. More than 30,000 Boer farms were burned before the war ended. Crops standing in the fields were put to the torch. Orchards were cut down. Wells were fouled or filled. Livestock, tens of thousands of cattle, sheep, and horses, were slaughtered or driven away. The veldt that had once sustained a nation of farmers was methodically transformed into something closer to a wasteland. It was devastatingly effective as military logic and morally catastrophic as human action. The columns moved with grim efficiency, soldiers who had enlisted to fight an army finding themselves burning the homes of women and children instead. But fire alone could not cage the commandos. They were too fast, too familiar with the terrain, too capable of slipping through any cordon thrown against them. Kitchener's second instrument was wire and stone. Beginning in earnest through 1901, British engineers constructed what became one of the most extraordinary military engineering projects in colonial history. Blockhouses, small fortified posts of corrugated iron and stone, were erected at intervals of roughly 1,000 yards across the entire theater of operations. Each was garrisoned by a handful of soldiers with clear lines of sight in all directions. Between them, double fences of barbed wire, sometimes threaded with tin cans to rattle in the darkness, stretched across the landscape. By the war's end, more than 8,000 blockhouses had been built, connected by nearly 4,000 miles of wire. The open veldt was slowly divided into compartments, each one a potential trap. The genius of the system was in combination with movement. With the landscape gridded by static defenses, Kitchener launched his drives. Thousands of troops, sometimes more than 20,000 men in a single operation, advanced in extended lines across the compartments, pushing the commandos ahead of them toward the wire. The drives were slow, grinding, exhausting affairs, covering enormous distances on foot through heat and dust. Many failed. The Boers found gaps, slipped through at night, doubled back. De Wet, seemingly indestructible, escaped again and again. Yet the net was tightening. The burned farms meant no food waiting at the next valley. The blockhouse lines meant routes that had once been open were now closed. Horses were harder to replace. Ammunition ran lower. The commandos were not yet broken, but they were being worn to the bone. Christian de Wet later wrote that by this period, his men sometimes went days without bread, riding horses so exhausted they could barely canter. The veldt that had been their sanctuary was becoming their prison. Kitchener's war was working, in the narrow sense of grinding down an enemy's capacity to resist. But the human cost of that grinding process, concentrated in a network of camps where tens of thousands of displaced civilians were being held, was about to force itself onto the world's attention in ways that would haunt the British Empire for generations. While Kitchener's columns burned their way across the veldt, the women and children left behind could not simply be abandoned on the open plains. That, at least, was the official reasoning. Displaced farm families, their homes reduced to ash and their livestock gone, gathered along roadsides with nowhere to go. British commanders began collecting them, loading them onto wagons and later cattle cars, and transporting them to a network of tented enclosures that would become one of the most notorious chapters in the history of the British Empire. The camps grew with frightening speed. By mid-1901, more than 100,000 Boer civilians were confined in roughly 45 camps scattered across the Transvaal and Orange River colony. The administration had not planned for numbers like these. Tents designed for soldiers housed families of 6, 8, 10 people. The ground between canvas rows turned quickly to mud in the rains and choking dust in the dry season. Rations were calculated on a sliding scale, with families of men still fighting in the field receiving measurably less food than those whose husbands and fathers had surrendered. It was a deliberate policy of pressure. It was also a death sentence. The camps lacked almost everything necessary to keep a concentrated population alive. Water supplies were contaminated, drawn from sources shared between the living quarters and the latrines. Soap was scarce. Medical facilities were nearly non-existent in the early months. And into these conditions, the British military packed thousands upon thousands of children, many already weakened by the trauma of watching their homes burn. Disease moved through the camps like fire through dry grass. Measles arrived first among children who had never been exposed to it, tearing through tent rows with terrifying speed. Behind measles came whooping cough, then typhoid carried in the contaminated water, then dysentery. Doctors, where they existed at all, were overwhelmed within days of any new outbreak. Families watched their children develop fevers on Monday and die by Thursday. Mothers who had survived the burning of their farms, who had kept their families together through the chaos of displacement, found themselves burying small bodies in the rocky ground outside the camp perimeter. The death rate in some camps climbed to levels that, annualized, would have killed every person inside within a single year. Into this horror stepped a small, determined woman from Cornwall named Emily Hob House. A social reformer with no official standing and no government authorization, she arrived in South Africa in late 1900 and spent months traveling between camps, documenting with meticulous care what she found. She measured tent sizes. She recorded ration weights. She interviewed mothers, nurses, and the occasional horrified British officer who had the conscience to acknowledge what surrounded him. Her report, delivered to the British government in June 1901, was a document of quiet, devastating precision. She wrote of children with stick-thin limbs and swollen bellies. She described a camp of 6,000 people with a single doctor. She noted, without theatrical embellishment, that the mortality rate among children under 5 had reached levels that defied comprehension. The British government's initial response was to attack the messenger. Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain dismissed her findings. Newspapers loyal to the war effort called her naive, hysterical, a traitor to her own soldiers. When she attempted to return to South Africa that August, she was detained aboard ship and sent back to England by force. But the numbers could not be suppressed forever. By the war's end in May 1902, approximately 28,000 Boer civilians had died in the camps. More than 22,000 of them were children under 16. The figure entered history like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through decades of debate about empire, conscience, and the true cost of colonial ambition. Emily Hob House, ignored and ridiculed while the camps were still killing, would be mourned as a national heroine by the Boer people when she died in 1926. Her ashes were interred at the Women's Monument in Bloemfontein. The dying in the camps had not ended the war. Across the veldt, exhausted commandos were reaching the limits of what flesh and will could endure. The story told in history books about the Boer War is, at its core, a story about white people. British soldiers against Boer commandos. Emily Hob House against Joseph Chamberlain. 28,000 Boer civilians against the indifference of an empire. It is a story that has been told, debated, and memorialized for over a century. But there is another story, larger and darker, that has been almost entirely erased. The Boer War was never a white man's war. From the first shots fired at Mafeking in October 1899 to the final negotiations at Vereeniging in May 1902, hundreds of thousands of black Africans were drawn into the conflict on every side. The British employed them as scouts, runners, guards, and intelligence gatherers. The Boers relied on them as farm laborers, wagon drivers, and domestic servants who kept the commando system functioning. Some were armed. Many more were pressed into service without being asked. All of them bore consequences they had not chosen. What did they stand to gain? Very little, as events would prove. Black African leaders in some regions initially hoped that a British victory might bring an expansion of political rights, that defeating the Boer republics, whose racial policies were among the harshest in southern Africa, might open some door toward recognition. It was a hope that the British government would decisively and coldly abandon at the peace table. But before the peace came the camps. And the camps, it turns out, were not only for Boer civilians. Across the same landscape where Boer women and children were being concentrated, British authorities established a separate parallel network of camps for black Africans displaced by the Scorched Earth campaign. These camps housed farm workers whose employers had been captured or had fled, families driven from the land as Kitchener's columns burned everything that could sustain guerrilla resistance. At their peak, these camps held somewhere between 115,000 and 150,000 people. The conditions inside them were, by almost every measurable standard, worse than those in the Boer camps. Rations were smaller. Medical attention was even more scarce. The administrative record-keeping, already chaotic in the white camps, was in the black camps almost non-existent. Deaths were recorded inconsistently, incompletely, or not at all. This is why the numbers remain uncertain more than a century later. The best estimates suggest that at least 20,000 black Africans died in these camps. Some historians place the figure considerably higher. The uncertainty itself is a form of violence, a reflection of how little the colonial administration valued the lives it was extinguishing. Emily Hob House visited the Boer camps and wrote a report that shook Parliament. No equivalent voice rose for the black camps. No inquiry was commissioned specifically to investigate their death rates. When the war ended, the suffering inside them vanished from official memory almost immediately. The Peace of Vereeniging, signed in May 1902, confirmed what black Africans had feared. The question of extending political rights to non-white populations in the former republics was explicitly deferred, set aside to be decided later by the white governments that would inherit power. As history records meant never. The foundations of the apartheid state were not built in 1948. They were laid in the ashes of the veldt, ratified in the terms of a peace agreement, and cemented in the silence that followed. The men and women who labored, suffered, and died in those forgotten camps received no monument at Bloemfontein. Their names were largely unrecorded. Their numbers remain disputed. They were essential to every phase of a war fought by others for stakes that never truly included them. What does it mean to lose 20,000 people and leave almost no trace? It means the history that follows is built on a silence, and silences, as Southern Africa would spend the next century discovering, have consequences. Among all the voices raised against the conduct of the Boer War, none cut more deeply than that of a slight, determined Cornishwoman named Emily Hob House. Where generals saw necessary measures and politicians saw military strategy, she saw children dying. Hob House arrived in South Africa in late 1900, traveling under the auspices of the South African Women and Children Distress Fund. What she found in the camps around Bloemfontein and beyond defied the official reassurances being offered in London. Tents packed beyond capacity. Rations measured in fractions. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes. Measles spreading through populations with no resistance and no medicine. She recorded everything, names, numbers, testimonies, with the methodical fury of someone who understood that detail was the only weapon available to her. When she returned to Britain in the spring of 1901 and presented her findings to Parliament, the response from the government was initially one of dismissal. Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain questioned her conclusions. Military commanders suggested she had been manipulated by Boer sympathizers. Lord Kitchener, conducting the war from Pretoria, was privately contemptuous. But the public was listening. Her report, published in June of 1901, reached hundreds of thousands of readers. The numbers she cited were not abstractions. They were death rates. Monthly mortality in some camps was running at annualized rates exceeding 200 per thousand, figures that placed the camps among the deadliest environments on Earth. The political pressure eventually became impossible to ignore. The government commissioned what became known as the Fawcett Commission, a committee of women led by the suffragist Millicent Fawcett, sent to inspect the camps and report independently. The commission's findings, delivered in late 1901, largely confirmed what Hob House had documented. Overcrowding was severe. Medical facilities were wholly inadequate. Administrative failures were compounding natural disease into catastrophe. Reforms followed. Rations were improved. Medical staff were sent. Mortality rates began to fall through the final months of the war. But the question that echoed through Parliament and through subsequent history was a simple and devastating one. How many had already died? The answer, assembled painstakingly from incomplete records, settled at approximately 28,000 Boer civilians, the majority of them children under the age of 16. It was the Liberal leader Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman who gave the moral verdict its most lasting form. In a speech that drew outrage from the government benches and applause from history, he asked what phrase should describe a policy of systematic devastation. His answer, methods of barbarism, attached itself permanently to the British conduct of the war. The reforms came too late for the children already buried in the South African earth. But the scandal had done something beyond saving lives. It had placed the machinery of empire under a moral examination from which it would never entirely recover. The war itself was nearly over. But what would ending it cost? By 1902, the Boer War had become something stranger and more painful than a simple fight between two peoples. It had become a war between the Boers themselves. The long months of guerrilla fighting had forced an impossible question upon every man still carrying a rifle in the veldt. How much more could be endured? The answers split the Boer community along lines that would leave scars for generations. Those who chose to fight on called themselves bitter enders. The name required no explanation. They would see this through to the finish, whatever the finish brought. Sustained by a fierce Calvinist faith, many bitter enders interpreted their suffering in explicitly biblical terms. A chosen people tested in the wilderness, their cause ordained by God. Commandant generals like Christian de Wet and Couz de la Rey remained in the field, their bands growing leaner but no less determined, striking at British columns and vanishing into the grasslands before reinforcements could arrive. But others had broken. Exhausted men, watching their farms burned and their families interned, made the calculation that further resistance was not courage but cruelty. They surrendered. The British called them hands-uppers, a term that mixed relief with contempt. Then came something darker still. Some surrendered Boers agreed to take up arms for the British, forming units the British called the National Scouts. To the bitter enders, this was the deepest imaginable betrayal. Scouts were despised, sometimes shot when captured, regarded as men who had sold their people for rations and safety. The bitterness between these factions would outlast the war itself, poisoning Afrikaner politics for decades. Yet, even as the movement fractured, it produced one of its most audacious chapters. In August of 1901, a young lawyer-turned-commando leader named Jan Smuts led a ragged force of roughly 300 men across the Orange River and into the Cape Colony. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to carry the war into British territory, inspire a rebellion among Cape Afrikaners, and stretch British resources to breaking point. Smuts's column suffered terribly. Horses died. Men went without boots, wrapping their feet in rawhide stripped from dead animals. They were hunted continuously. Yet they survived, covering thousands of miles through the mountains and plains of the Cape, never destroyed, never quite caught. By the time peace negotiations began in earnest, Smuts's force was still in the field, an extraordinary testament to what human endurance and human stubbornness could sustain. The British commanders knew they could not simply wait the guerrillas out. The blockhouse lines, the camp system, the burned farms had not broken resistance. They had only revealed its depth. Something would have to give. On both sides, exhaustion was becoming indistinguishable from wisdom. The road to peace was opening, though nobody yet knew what it would cost to walk it. The road to peace began not in a grand hall, but in a series of tense, exhausted conversations between men who had been trying to kill each other for nearly 3 years. In late March of 1902, Kitchener arranged a preliminary meeting with Boer representatives, including the quietly brilliant Jan Smuts, still dusty from his Cape Colony campaign. Kitchener wanted an end. He had the blockhouse lines, the camps, the scorched earth, and still the Commandos Road. The British Treasury had spent over £200 million. The British public, once hungry for imperial glory, was growing tired of the bill. The Boers came to the table carrying something heavier than exhaustion. They carried the knowledge of what the camps had done to their people. Estimates would later place the death toll of Boer civilians in British concentration camps at roughly 28,000, the vast majority of them children. That number sat in the room during every negotiation, unspoken but never absent. In May of 1902, 60 Boer delegates gathered at the small town of Vereeniging on the Vaal River. What followed was one of the most agonizing democratic debates in the history of any people at war. Field commanders arrived from the veldt with their own counts. How many fighting men remained? How much ammunition? How many horses? The numbers told a story of a movement that had been remarkable but could not survive much longer. Roughly 17,000 burghers were still in the field against a British force of nearly 250,000. And yet men argued passionately for continuing. To surrender, some said, was to betray the dead, to erase the sacrifices of everything that had come before. Christian de Wet spoke with the fire he had shown in the veldt. Coos de la Rey, a commander respected by both sides, spoke more quietly and more devastatingly. The Boer people, he said, could not be sacrificed for a cause that could no longer succeed. Victory was gone. What remained was the question of what survival would look like. On the 31st of May, 1902, the delegates voted. 54 in favor of accepting British terms. 6 against. The war was over. The Treaty of Vereeniging formally ended the conflict. The Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, were absorbed into the British Empire. In return, the British promised responsible self-government in due course, £3 million in reconstruction aid, and protection of the Dutch language in schools and courts. It was a settlement more generous than many expected from Kitchener, though generosity is a complicated word for the destruction of two nations. The full cost of the war was staggering. More than 22,000 British and Imperial soldiers died, roughly 8,000 in combat, the rest from disease. Boer combatant losses numbered around 7,000. Including the civilian dead in the camps, the total toll across all communities, including the often forgotten black Africans who suffered tremendously in the conflict, exceeded 75,000 lives. On the day the treaty was signed, grown men wept openly in Vereeniging. Not from relief, but from grief. The commandants folded away their flags and rode home to farms that no longer existed, toward families broken by months behind barbed wire. They had not been beaten in the field, and they knew it. That knowledge would become the seed of something new. The Afrikaners would remember. They would rebuild. And within a decade, the men who signed that treaty would find themselves, improbably, governing the very country that had defeated them. The Peace of Vereeniging was an ending, but in the long arc of South African history, it was also a beginning. The ink was barely dry on the Treaty of Vereeniging when Lord Alfred Milner set about remaking South Africa in Britain's image. His vision was total. An English-speaking, economically modern dominion loyal to the crown. To rebuild the shattered gold mines of the Rand, he made a decision that would haunt the region for decades. Between 1904 and 1906, roughly 63,000 Chinese laborers were imported under contract conditions so restrictive they amounted to little more than indentured servitude. The move sparked outrage in Britain and deep resentment in South Africa, from Boers who wanted the land for themselves and from black Africans who found yet another group placed above them in the colonial hierarchy. But Milner's grand design began to crumble faster than he expected. In 1906, a new liberal government in London shifted course. Rather than punishing the defeated Boers, Britain chose reconciliation. Self-government was granted to the Transvaal in 1906 and to the Orange River Colony the following year. It was a political gamble of breathtaking speed. Within 5 years of their defeat, former Boer commanders sat in parliaments and cabinet rooms. Louis Botha became Prime Minister of the Transvaal. Jan Smuts became his deputy. The men who had ridden against the British Empire were now administering it. What followed was the South Africa Act of 1909, passed in Westminster without a single black African voice consulted in its drafting. On the 31st of May, 1910, exactly 8 years after the Treaty of Vereeniging, the Union of South Africa came into existence. 4 colonies became one nation, and Britain congratulated itself on a remarkable act of statesmanship. But for the majority of South Africa's population, the Union was a locked door. During negotiations, there had been quiet promises, careful language suggesting that black political rights might eventually be addressed. They were not. Outside the Cape Colony, where a limited property-based franchise already existed, black Africans had no vote, no representation, and no path to either. The new nation was built for white South Africans. The Boers had lost the war and won the peace, sharing power only among themselves. The consequences were not slow in coming. In 1913, the Natives Land Act confined black Africans to less than 8% of the country's land. In 1912, the African National Congress had already been founded, a direct response to the betrayal written into South Africa's founding documents. And the Afrikaner resentment that had smoldered since Vereeniging never fully cooled. It found expression in language movements, in churches, in political parties that preached the destiny of a chosen people wronged by empire. The bitterness of the concentration camps and the burned farms fed a nationalism that grew more rigid with each passing decade. By 1948, that nationalism had a name for what it wanted to build, and the word was apartheid. What does it mean when a war refuses to end? The guns fell silent in 1902, but the Boer War's reverberations never truly stopped. They moved forward through time like tremors from a buried fault line, reshaping warfare, reshaping empire, reshaping the moral vocabulary of the modern world. Military professionals studying the conflict saw something their superiors were reluctant to admit. The war had exposed the British Army as institutionally unprepared for modern combat. Accurate rifles, coordinated defensive fire, soldiers who moved and thought independently rather than marching in parade ground formations, these were the lessons the Boers had taught on the veldt. The British Army reformed slowly and imperfectly, but the deeper lesson went unlearned. When the Western Front consumed a generation after 1914, the tactical problems were strikingly familiar. Entrenched defenders with accurate weapons, attackers unable to cross open ground, a war that dragged on far longer than anyone predicted. The Boer War had been a rehearsal that the audience failed to understand. The concentration camps occupy a darker place in history's reckoning. Emily Hob House had named what she saw with moral clarity, but the full weight of that system took decades to be absorbed. 26,000 Boer civilians died. The black African death toll, long suppressed and deliberately unrecorded, likely exceeded that number. What had been improvised as a military measure became, in the 20th century's terrible unfolding, a template. The deliberate imprisonment of civilian populations, the use of starvation as policy, the bureaucratic machinery of mass suffering. These methods did not originate at Auschwitz or the Soviet camps. They had earlier colonial addresses. For Britain, The war shattered something that could not be reassembled. The self-assured imperial confidence of the Victorian age, the certainty that expansion meant civilization and that civilization was naturally British. That confidence cracked under the weight of the camps, the battlefield failures, and the cost. Nearly 500,000 soldiers deployed to subdue fewer than 90,000 fighters. The price in treasure, reputation, and life was one the empire could afford only once. Afrikaner memory transformed the war into a founding myth. Suffering of women and children in the camps became a sacred wound, a story told to children, commemorated in monuments, woven into a national identity defined by grievance and survival. That mythology powered the rise of apartheid and justified its cruelties in the language of a people who knew persecution firsthand, yet chose to become persecutors. And still, for decades, one story went almost entirely untold. The tens of thousands of Black South Africans who fought, who labored, who suffered, who died in a war conducted over their land and without their consent. Their names were omitted from monuments, their graves unmarked, their roles written out of the official record. Recovering that history is the unfinished work of our own time. The Boer War does not belong only to the past. It belongs to every reckoning with what empire actually costs, and who is always made to pay. The Boer War's true ledger, written in the lives of the forgotten as much as the celebrated, is still being tallied today. Subscribe for more histories that refuse to look away.